So thank you for joining me this morning, and good morning. I'm Bosserman, for those of you who don't know me, and I direct the Middle East and North Africa initiative here at MDN and the New Policy Institute. And this was a project that got started a little over a year ago when we kind of looked at the U.S. response to the Arab awakenings across the region in Middle East and North Africa and thought that there was more that could be done, that there were things that people could do from outside the interagency and outside the government to perhaps mobilize and organize the whole suite of resources from the private sector, civil society, both here and abroad, to try and leverage up those resources to really build a more robust engagement strategy with the Middle East and North Africa, in particular around an economic engagement strategy and an economic relationship. We think that there's a lot of opportunity there in approaching these regions. And about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, when I really started doing this work, I would go to a lot of these panels and discussions, which I'm sure many of you have been to as well. And in the immediate aftermath of the Arab uprisings, you would have people discussing at these dozens and dozens of panels of the U.S. response to the Arab Spring. And often you would go the entire panel without anyone actually using the word economics or talking about the economic situation. And I think, now as we look a few years later at the ongoing political and economic crises in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere, the huge unemployment issues, that I think that our engagement on that front was prescient, and I think that it really highlights the really important need to have an economic piece around our strategy. So the presentation that I'm going to go through today is something that I've been showing around Capitol Hill for the last couple of weeks, and it really pulls in some market research, some polling from both the United States as well as the region, and kind of makes this argument, and the argument that we've been making here at the MENA Initiative for a while, but really kind of identifies some unique opportunities with some market-tested data that I think some people will find surprising, that there's really opportunities to engage here. There's opportunities within public opinion that are more positive than often people think. And so it's very easy when looking at the Middle East in general and with the Arab transitions in particular to get pessimistic or nihilistic about the hopes for engaging or doing anything productive. And I think that what I wanted to show today is some data, some ways to frame this argument to be more positive, more uplifting, to kind of identify some of the unique opportunities there. And so that's what we're going to go through today. And as far as the actual platform, you all have a chat box below you. After I finish, I'll go ahead and unmute you guys. And so if you have questions, if you have speakers and want to ask questions, that's great. And otherwise, you can feel free to use the chat box to ask questions. I'll try to engage you there as well. So a real opportunity to lead, that's kind of the overarching message of this presentation as we get going. So some of the critical top lines that we look at are, here's the main takeaways that we've found from working with policymakers and talking to people and looking through a lot of the data, is that what's going to be really important as we put together our strategy is to forge sustained relationships with these countries and to articulate that it's not just charity, that this is actually critical to U.S. long-term and medium-term strategic interests, that this is a region of the world that for a long time has exported terror and chaos, and actually seeing these countries move over to more modern, open, democratic societies is going to be vital for a whole range of U.S. strategic interests in the region, U.S. economic interests as they pertain to oil, energy, the global market in those products, as well as just the ability to move these countries into a more open, inegalitarian world. It's important to come away with the idea that we have a strategy and that we need to finish the job. I think that a lot of especially out in the public space in America, a lot of folks are in fact, tired of dealing with the Middle East. But a lot of that is that, they've seen a huge expenditure of blood and treasure in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what they haven't seen yet is a real credible strategy for finishing that job, for actually taking advantage, or I don't know if it's taking advantage, but actually not wasting the opportunity of the 10 years of involvement we've had in the region so far at that level, and actually stepping in now, moving beyond a military and defense frame, moving beyond an explicitly counterterrorism frame, and actually frame the economic piece and economic engagement and the diplomatic engagement piece as really the way to finish this job in the Middle East and to move these countries into more democratic societies. Patience is obviously going to be important. This is particularly challenging sometimes with policymakers on the Hill, but when you see very loud voices in the media, on television, calling for people to pull out, especially when you see flames over U.S. embassies overseas, it becomes easy to just say, look, we're going to wall off and not deal with this anymore. But it's important to understand that these transitions are not going to be linear. There's going to be a bumpy road, but it's actually worth it in the end. If there's a plan, we can get there. It's going to require patience. Focusing on the economic growth piece is critical. I talked about this in the beginning, and we'll get into more of this in detail later on. But the economic growth piece is actually important to understanding and resonating with the American public and with policymakers about why this is keenly in U.S. strategic interests about building out these relationships. It's something that we can do that's very concrete. It's a way that we can incentivize a lot of action in some of these governments. It addresses real security threats and needs that they feel there. And it also, when you look at some of the actual data on public perceptions about trade and economic engagement, this is really kind of the key that unlocks a desire among the American public to be more engaged. And so all of that is to say that there's political running room in this discussion more than often people think. So some of the quick background about why this is so important is looking at unemployment and economic crisis to really come to characterize a lot of the instability throughout the region. I don't have to tell a lot of you this, but I mean huge youth bulge, demographic bomb in a lot of these countries, incredibly young populations, and a tremendous amount of them are unemployed. And so whatever goal you're looking at or trying to achieve, whether it be security, political, stability, any kind of goal, it's really impossible to imagine a straight line between where we are now and where you want to go that doesn't involve going through real, robust, broad-based economic reform and growth, creating economic opportunities for this enormous population. And I think that when you look at a chart like this and really think about this and think about this generation in waiting, as it's been called by some people, that the question is, what are they waiting for? And I think we have to internalize the fact that if we don't actually engage and really help build out and lead to robust economic growth in these places, that radicalization should be expected. That is the opportunity cost for not engaging and not helping these countries develop right now. And we've increasingly seen that we can't limit that to being on someone else's doorstep, that has a way of coming home. And so there really is a cost of not acting, of not having a strategy. And so that's important to keep in mind as we go forward. As you look out, a lot of commentators often think, that we have these elections in some of these transition countries and they elected Islamists. Obviously, each of these countries are different. Each of the parties are different. But that was certainly a trend. I mean, you've taken some hyperbolic commentators taken to calling it an Islamist winter, which I think is far, far from accurate. But it is true that Islamist parties had a head start in a lot of the political organizing. It was pretty well, it should have been expected, and it was by a lot of people, that they would actually come in the immediate aftermath of a lot of these revolutions. But I think it's important that even among these populations who elected Islamist governments, that they still overwhelmingly, the populations want democracy. They favor more open governments. They favor more democratic governments, even though they elected, the Islamist governments that don't look as democratic as what oftentimes people here in the United States understand as democratic. But this should not be understood by policymakers to think that they've rejected across the Middle East the notion of democracy. There's still lots of opportunity there. You can see it's overwhelming numbers. But it's important also to understand that a lot of the way that they understand democracy in the Middle East and North Africa is through a lens of economics. And so you'll see that the provision of basic necessities is the #1 characteristic of democracy that a lot of people identify when you poll them in the region. And low levels of inequality are something that's important to them as well. And so those poll higher as key characteristics and indicators of a democratic government society than elections and ability to criticize your government, free press, things like that. Those are all important. Obviously, it's all part of the larger mix of what we want these countries to have going forward. But if we're not talking about economics in these countries, not understanding that the provision of basic necessities is going to be fundamental before and alongside everything else that we do, that is just as important. If we don't understand that, it's going to be a problem for us going forward. And even when you look at the threats that are viewed in country. This is a recent poll that was just done at the very end of last year across the region, the Middle East and North Africa, and when asked what the biggest threat was that was facing each of their individual countries as well as the region as a whole, overwhelmingly you'll see that they identified economic challenge as the number one threat. You'll see that things like security, terrorism, infrastructure all register, but they don't register anywhere near as high as economics. And something you'll see on this chart is that from left to right, this is a time series. These same questions were asked a year ago as well, back in 2011. You'll see that that economic concerns has actually gone up from 40 to 47% in the last year. So this is important and rising area of concern for them. So we really need to be focusing on this. Now, the question comes back to what's the American public care, and what are their interests in this, and how do they view the region? It's easy to look out, as I said before, and say that Americans just want to get out. They don't care about providing aid or having economic engagement. They just don't want to deal with the Middle East. But when you actually ask them these questions about whether or not a more democratic, more open Middle East is in U.S. strategic interest, they understand overwhelmingly that this is in the U.S. strategic interest to do this, to see these countries democratize, to see them open and become normalized members of the world stage and the world community is something that the American people understand in concept. Right? This is a relatively easy lift for them to get there if you can frame it in these terms. And what's interesting is that even when you say on any given issue they might be less inclined to support any particular U.S. policy, they still see that on net the American public supports more democratic and more open governments in this region. So it would be wrong again to go ahead and say that that Americans don't understand this basic argument. It's easy for us, those of us inside the Beltway, often to think that we understand the nuances of the contours of this region and the importance that it has, and that it's lost on people in Iowa and elsewhere. But I think that when you actually look at this data, you'll find that that's not entirely true. Now, when you look at, obviously, aid is just one piece of this puzzle. We have, strategic allocation of aid to a lot of these countries. A lot of this comes up around the context of Egypt lately, but it's much broader than that. It's aid, it's trade, it's diplomatic engagement. It's a whole host of things. It's about creating other types of investment in the region. But obviously, aid is oftentimes a proxy, and it's also an essential component in a lot of these countries. And so when you look at, obviously this is kind of the big joke for people in the know here in D.C., that when you talk about budget debates, everyone always wants to, the only thing they agree about is cutting the foreign aid budget. And so that becomes very difficult to sell that often to members of Congress, that it's easy to cut because they think there's no support for it. But one of the things that this specific chart shows, that when you actually ask this question about whether or not we're providing too much or too little foreign aid, there's all complete ignorance about how much we actually provide in foreign aid. Right? The general consensus is that people think that we provide around 25% of our federal budget to foreign aid. It's obviously ridiculous. It's right around 1%. And so there's actually an incredible opportunity to move this number, though, around aid and around the aid relationship that the U.S. has. Because when you ask the question, simply by telling people, given that we only spend 1% of our federal budget on aid, do you then believe we spend too much or too little? When you just tell them that one basic thing about how much we're actually spending, you see an incredible shift. You can see that here for the dramatic changes in those responses, that just when you tell them we only spend 1% on foreign aid, that the percentage saying that we should spend more is by far the most popular response. It goes from 17% to 36%, and the people saying that we should spend less on foreign aid drops from 54% down to 24%. That's an enormous shift from literally just telling people one basic fact, and a basic fact that's easy to remember. So I think that one of the takeaways there is that when anyone's talking about foreign aid to a non-expert audience, that they should always be in the very same sentence saying, given that it's only 1% of our budget, we could be doing more. Right? This is a really simple thing to tie in, but it should always be part of the messaging, just highlighting how much of the budget is actually foreign aid. And you can actually, because that simple education piece is really powerful. I mentioned this earlier about how there's a popular perception of engagement fatigue with the Middle East, and I think that that's true, but I also think that it centers around a unique fatigue around the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's the largest kind of frame and strategy that people view about how we've been engaged in the region over the last decade. And the perception is that those military interventions didn't work. The Bush administration obviously promised all sorts of things that would come through those invasions that certainly ended up being a much harder road than was promised to a lot of people, a much more expensive road, both in human life and in dollars and cents, but also because the narrative that we have coming out really has focused much more on the defense and the security frame, the counterterrorism frame, which is much more difficult for people to get behind than focusing on economics, prosperity, U.S. interests, and actually having a light at the end of the tunnel, actually having a strategy and feeling like we're going somewhere, that we're on a path, even if it's rocky and there'll be ups and downs, but feeling that we can actually finish the job here, we can move these countries into the world community, we can actually have a level of stability that benefits U.S. interests, and actually having a vision of what that means, and then tying it to U.S. interests is going to be important. That's a really important frame and can really motivate individuals when you talk to them about it into becoming less anxious to get out and more willing to engage. And so one of the things that keeps me optimistic about this general strategy and generally working with these countries in the Middle East, North Africa, is the fact that we don't need, it's not a failure of imagination from a policy sense. There's a huge role for a lot of the tactical level of engagement and making sure that we have best practices in doing all of this, but at the end of the day, the grand strategy we've done before and we've seen it before. I mean, it's the same principles embodied in the Marshall Plan after World War II. We've seen successful development models in Indonesia, other parts of Asia and Latin America, and we have what we call here at NDN kind of the American formula or an American recipe for bringing bringing more open governments to the rest of the world. And these are open markets, rule of law, political liberty, and building robust civil society. Now, there's nothing particularly innovative about this, and that's exactly the point. That we don't need. What's missing is not a million Nobel laureates sitting around a table cracking the code on the actual ingredients for helping bring these countries toward more open egalitarian societies. We actually know the basic things. A lot of it is a failure of political will and of being able to figure out the best way to do that, both bureaucratically as well as to move the appropriate forces in to do it. And so keeping that in mind, I think, is important, that we've been here before, we can learn from those things, and that it's really not, it's very attainable. And I think that the argument that unlocks this, I alluded to this earlier, is really the idea of finishing the job and doing that by boosting economic growth. Americans understand increasingly now, we'll get to some of the pretty shocking data in a moment, but Americans understand that we live in an interconnected and globalized world now, that our economic fates are intricately tied to those of the rest of the world. They understand the existence of global markets and of other countries in the world and how we're all intertwined, right? And this is happening incredibly rapidly, this realization. And so keying into this argument, this idea of globalization, and understanding that boosting economic growth in those countries is good for us as well, that those are mutually reinforcing concepts, is really important as far as tapping into public perception on engaging in the Middle East. Americans are pragmatic people at the end of the day, and what they want to know is that there's strategy, that even if there's short-term problems, even if there's going to be a rocky road, they want to know they're on a road, that road is going somewhere, and they can see where it's headed. And so keeping that in mind is really important when messaging and talking about these things in all walks in all contexts. And so it's important to talk about the fact that this economic engagement plan in transitioning these countries, it will work, that it's going to lead to stability in the medium and long term, and that's essential to promoting U.S. interests. And when you actually market test some of the language around this, you'll actually find that people understand this organically. People who understand that the U.S. has to continue to be a global leader in the world and be a leader in that part of the world in particular often link those opinions to protecting American national interests, and in particular viewing those in terms of economic growth and national security. The American public understands the idea that economic growth here and abroad is intricately linked to national security and the promotion of U.S. interests. And so we have to be framing all of these plans and policies in that frames if we expect people to come along with it. That's can unlock a lot of the larger strategies that we have is connecting our assistance to other nations, our engagement with other nations to intertwined economic growth for both us and them, and how that's tied to national strategy. Now, in particular, the president has really been pushing in this, even the early part of his second term, a really robust trade agenda. This takes form of TPP and other types of things. But it's important to understand that, again, trade is only part of this broader economic engagement agenda, and that, in turn, only part of the broader engagement agenda. But there's a tremendous opportunity for trade harmonization that can really build out more economic growth in this region relatively quickly. And a lot of people, especially on the Hill and other policymakers, think that there's huge opposition to the notions of trade, especially among Democratic base and in union organizations and things like that. But what they don't understand is these two graphs, this graph and the next one, show that there's actually been tremendous change in the American public's view of trade just over the last 2 years, to say nothing of the last 3 or 4. That you can see that it's actually the attitudes on foreign trade are definitely net positive, and that it's a huge, sharp increase. I think that I was meeting with someone just last week on the Hill, and they looked at this graph and they said that's really remarkable. Why do you think that happened? And I think that there's obviously a whole host of reasons, but I think one of them is that after the financial collapse in the recession, 2007, 2008, there was a lot of people who were really out of work. We really had to have a kind of a countrywide realization about the role of manufacturing and the role of globalization and how that's going to work for the future of this country. And at first, people were really burned. People were out of work. There was people, 45-year-old steel workers who think they'll never work again. But I think that now that we're a few years beyond that, we've really kind of internalized the realization that a lot of those jobs, those old manufacturing jobs, aren't coming back, that the United States is going to compete in other areas higher up the value chain, and that we need to that we want to be able to buy cheaper manufactured products at Walmart. And these are all basic realities of globalization that it's just taken some time for the American public to kind of marinate in and come around to, and that's really happened. And so there's a lot of opportunities here. And when you specifically ask them, the two arguments about understanding that more foreign trade benefits the United States versus just offshoring jobs, you actually see these really remarkable numbers. Over 60% understand that trade is net beneficial for the United States. And so this also creates a real opportunity, both in messaging, because this ties into the larger narrative about economic engagement with the rest of the world, economic engagement with these countries, building out a more aggressive trade relationship that can really help them build more opportunities in their countries and try to tackle some of the employment issues and lead to economic growth. But it's also important to conceive of as an incentive tool. So what oftentimes people don't understand is that intra-regional trade, that you trade inside the Middle East and North Africa themselves, is actually incredibly low. There's a lot of both formal and non-formal barriers to trade between countries, and intra-regional trade in the Middle East is actually lower than sub-Saharan Africa. And so there is, I think, we would love to see some kind of a regional free trade agreement, but in those at some point. But in the short term, in the medium term, there's a lot that we could be done with those countries to help facilitate just increased interregional trade, increased trade with the U.S. in certain sectors, and actually taking down some of those tariff and non-tariff barriers and some of those technical barriers to trade can actually really put the foot on the gas for scaling up some industries there that expands the economic base beyond just extractive natural resources. And that's going to be absolutely essential for lasting economic growth, is broadening the base. And so that's something that we should be targeting that can be really effective when we look forward. And it's also something that we can use as a non-check writing incentive for a lot of these governments. There are nascent industries around some light manufacturing, agricultural products, other types of things like that, that they would really like access to United States and European markets, and that there are barriers that we can be more cognizant of in trying to tear those down. And we can use those as incentives across a whole range of governance and reform agenda as we go forward. It's not just about coming to the table with $100 billion for Egypt you know, if we can work with them in part of a package of partnership and incentives is to work with them to open up markets for some of their industries. So this all kind of comes back to when we look at all of that and the opportunity that we have, a lot of the arguments that can be most effective about maintaining engaged in this region simply haven't been made or aren't made enough. And so a lot of this is actually the way that we talk about and frame our policies of engagement with different populations, with different constituencies is really important. There's a huge opportunity linking this to economic benefits to globalization, understanding that there's a real opportunity cost to not engaging in this region going forward, and that tying these to trade open markets, political liberty, rule of law, and focusing on robust civil society. One of the last things I want to say about the civil society piece is that when you market test funding and foreign aid in general of people, one of the things that actually increases the response rates and the positive response rates to foreign aid about pretty dramatically is when you frame the proposition in terms of providing assistance to either U.S.-based or on-the-ground civil society organizations directly, as opposed to government-to-government or military-to-military aid. And so a lot of what State Department's been doing over the last few years has been great work and really pushing ahead on doing more direct funding. Organizations like MEPI and elsewhere have been working to fund more civil society directly, and that's a big piece. It should be talked up a lot because it actually does move public perceptions of aid when they think that it's going to actual organizations as opposed to governments, where the perception is that the corruption and other forces kind of make it less effective. So when discussing supporting robust civil society and funding a lot of these programs, it's worth it to mention that when it's going directly to civil society, it's important to bring that up. And so then this just brings us back to kind of the critical top lines that we had before, which was forging relationships, finishing the job, economic growth, maintaining being patient with these transitions, and then I think a lot of this really highlights some of the opportunities that we have as far as framing messaging, as well as actually moving forward with some of the substantive policies and incentives that we can have with these countries going forward. So that's the deck, the brief version, and so we continue. The MENA initiative really supports a lot of this work through public programming. We work with a lot of people privately and throughout the interagency on Capitol Hill to try and bring them the resources they need to make these arguments more effectively and to try and think more strategically about these policies and remain engaged. And that's our mission here. We'll be putting out a new report on a lot of these, looking at the changing geopolitics of the region around energy. That'll be out next month. And so keep your eyes peeled for that. And then with that, I will actually go ahead, if you would like to be unmuted, if you can, and ask if you have a question, if you can just go ahead and let me know. You can type here in the chat box. I'd be happy to answer any questions if anyone would like to speak. See. All right. All right. Charles says, what are your opinions on global entrepreneurship initiatives in the region? So that's a great question. I think that there's a lot can be done. Interesting that you say that, because I was just talking to Shelley Porges yesterday, and we're actually going to be I guess this is the first public announcement. We're still working on the format, but Shelley Porges will be a guest here next month. We'll be releasing information on that a little bit later, and she will be stepping down from her post here, I believe, next week as the head of the Global Entrepreneurship Program at the State Department. And so she's been keenly involved in a lot of this work. And I think that there's a lot of great work in developing the larger ecosystem of entrepreneurship in the region that's incredibly important. I mentioned earlier kind of the vital role that broadening the economic base in a lot of these countries is going to be, and a lot of those programs both run by the State Department, but also some of them funded by the State Department through MEPI, through some other organizations that they're doing on the ground that are doing boot camps, as well as some some private equity firms that are actually going out and setting up both providing private capital as well as actually providing entrepreneurship development is really important. Those skills development is going to be critical because one of the things that we see in the region is that these are economies that really haven't been market economies in any way that we would recognize it over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And so a lot of the successful businesses were developed through rent-seeking, through relationships with the rulers, and so there isn't this same culture of entrepreneurship, of market capitalism, of development opportunities and things like that. And so it's not just some of the challenges aren't just a lack of access to capital, but they're actually training in kind of helping to reshape the culture of entrepreneurship on the ground. And so there's a lot of that energy is actually going at the moment kind of in the tech space, and I think that presents some unique opportunities. In particular, there's a lot of increased internet penetration in a lot of the countries in North Africa that it's developing rapidly, which creates opportunities for more high-tech development around apps and software and things like that, as well as the fact that more high-tech software companies are, you can start smaller and can scale more quickly. And frankly, a lot of the companies, the U.S. companies in particular, that have been interested in going over into that space and have higher toleration for risk, have been more of the high-tech tech companies. But I think it's also important to keep in mind as we look to shifting the economic, environment there and broadening the base that it can't just be tech companies, that it needs to be a full suite of economic activity from manufacturing, from infrastructure, and all sorts of other things as well, and services. So a lot of that has been led by the tech sector up until now, which is great. It would be great to see more industries and more companies taking a lead and getting involved in doing that as well. Any other questions, thoughts? And this will be, this is being recorded and we will post it up on our website and it'll be available. We'll send it around, and so you can feel free to share it with anyone else you think would be interested in seeing the presentation. We'll post the deck. It hasn't been, this deck itself, I've been showing it around privately, that hasn't been published publicly yet, so we're going to go ahead and polish that up and put it up on the website this week, and so it will be publicly available. And so feel free to direct anyone who might be interested, any of your colleagues, to see some of the stuff, and more than happy to share some of the other data that came in on the back end, some of the reports, and other thoughts on this stuff. Daniel says, is the U.S. government taking advantage of these tech investments? I think they have in some ways. I think that there's been some really interesting work that's come to fruition around some of these boot camps that have been starting up. There's a place called Flat Six Labs that's in Egypt that is there's a lot of tech money invested in it, and they do a lot of training around the tech space and about how to bootstrap a young business. And Secretary Clinton actually visited that space and brought a lot of attention to it a few months ago when she's touring the region. And so I think that, the government has funded and thrown its back behind some of this work in the tech space. But I think at the end of the day, the government's role is really in facilitating these relationships and introducing the folks who are willing to get involved and connecting them with the points of capital here in the United States, as well as the entrepreneurs and the trainers and the mentors who can really step in and build this out. A lot of the key for transforming these economies is making them less state-driven. And so I think that one of the things that the government, the USG, is good at is in connecting folks, to having a wide web of individuals and resources to be able to connect people who are appropriate to the private sector and the civil society organizations who can really leverage up those investments. And so I think that should be the focus of the USG policy on the tech investment, as well as the broader economic investment strategy in the region, is really trying to either secure loans, private sector loans, and really leverage up private sector capital and investment. Other thoughts? Great. Well, thank you guys very much. I really appreciate you coming by. Like I said, we'll have this up on the website, and please feel free to email me Any questions, give me a call. Happy to set up other private briefings or share some of this information, and look forward to working with you guys more down the road. Thanks. Have a great day.